She's just a quiet librarian, nobody special. The gunman sneered as he forced Zara Mitchell to her knees in the center of the downtown library. What he didn't expect was for her to calmly analyze his psychological profile, predict his next 3 moves, and coordinate a tactical response that would leave federal agents speechless. By the time her younger brother Noah arrived with the FBI hostage rescue team, the situation had been neutralized by someone who was supposed to be cataloging books, not reading people like open files. Welcome to Those Who Left a Trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets. Before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you speechless, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that everyone deserves respect no matter how they appear on the surface, hit that subscribe button. Zara Mitchell had perfected the art of invisibility over the course of 3 years working at the Chicago Central Library. At 29 years old, she stood 5 feet 7 inches tall with dark brown hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses that she didn't actually need for vision, and clothing that was deliberately chosen to help her blend into the background of academic environments. Her job as a research librarian in the psychology and criminology section provided the perfect cover for someone who needed to remain anonymous while staying close to the kind of information that had once defined her professional existence. The library's regulars knew her as a helpful woman who could locate obscure research materials, recommend relevant academic sources, and maintain a kind of quiet efficiency that made the reading rooms feel like sanctuaries from the chaos of urban life. College students preparing dissertations appreciated her ability to guide them toward resources they hadn't known existed. Professors researching specialized topics valued her knack for connecting seemingly unrelated information into coherent research paths. Law enforcement personnel who occasionally used the library's criminal justice databases found her assistance invaluable, though none of them suspected that her expertise came from practical field experience rather than academic study. Zara's carefully constructed routine involved arriving each morning at 7:30, 30 minutes before the library opened to the public. She would spend those 30 minutes reviewing overnight security reports, checking database updates, and preparing for whatever research requests the day might bring. Her workstation in the psychology section was positioned to provide clear sight lines to all entrances and exits, a detail that appeared coincidental but had been deliberately chosen based on tactical considerations that most librarians would never think to evaluate. The truth was that Zara Mitchell possessed skills that had nothing to do with library science and everything to do with behavioral analysis, threat assessment, and crisis management. For 6 years before arriving in Chicago, she had worked as a criminal profiler for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, specializing in cases involving organized crime, domestic terrorism, and serial offenses that required understanding criminal psychology at levels most people couldn't imagine. Her expertise in reading human behavior had been developed through exposure to some of the darkest aspects of criminal activity. She could assess personality disorders from conversation patterns, identify potential violence from microexpressions, and predict criminal behavior with accuracy that had earned her commendations from supervisors who understood the value of someone who could think like the people they were hunting. These skills had made her exceptionally good at her job and exceptionally dangerous to the criminal organizations she had helped dismantle. 3 years ago, that expertise had made her the target of a revenge plot that had cost her everything she thought she was fighting to protect. A case involving human trafficking organizations with connections to political corruption had required her to testify before federal grand juries about evidence that could have destroyed careers and ended criminal enterprises worth millions of dollars. The testimony had been given under sealed proceedings that were supposed to protect her identity, but leaks from inside the justice system had made her name and face known to people who measure revenge in body counts rather than legal proceedings. The threats had started with anonymous phone calls and progressed to surveillance that made normal life impossible. When a bomb had been discovered in her apartment building, federal marshals had informed her that her cover had been completely blown and that remaining in her position would endanger not only her own life, but the lives of colleagues who worked cases related to her testimony. The choice had been simple: accept relocation to a completely new identity or accept that her career in federal law enforcement was over. Zara had chosen reinvention over retirement, but she had also chosen a new identity that kept her close to the kind of work that had defined her professional existence. The research librarian position allowed her to maintain access to criminal justice databases, psychological research, and case studies that helped her stay current with developments in behavioral analysis. More importantly, it provided a cover story that explained her knowledge of criminal behavior without raising questions about her background or her reasons for avoiding certain types of attention. The irony was that her new life as a librarian had brought her more peace than her career in federal law enforcement had ever provided. The quiet environment, the academic atmosphere, and the opportunity to help people with legitimate research needs had given her a sense of purpose that didn't involve exposure to the worst aspects of human nature. She had found genuine satisfaction in helping college students understand complex psychological theories, assisting legal professionals with research that supported legitimate prosecutions, and maintaining the kind of intellectual sanctuary that libraries provided for people seeking knowledge rather than causing harm. But peace, Zara had learned, was often temporary, especially for people whose skills made them valuable in situations that normal citizens never expected to encounter. The skills that made her effective as an FBI profiler couldn't be completely suppressed. Even when she was helping someone locate academic sources or organizing research materials. She continued to read people automatically, assess threats unconsciously, and maintain situational awareness that was far beyond what any librarian would need for routine job responsibilities. These habits had served her well in the library environment, helping her identify potentially problematic patrons before they caused disturbances, recognize individuals who might be using library resources for inappropriate purposes, and maintain the kind of safe, productive atmosphere that encouraged legitimate research and study. Her colleagues appreciated her ability to handle difficult situations with calm professionalism, though none of them understood that her composure came from experience with far more dangerous circumstances than overdue book disputes or computer access arguments. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in March. Zara arrived at 7:30 to find the overnight security reports indicating normal activity, no unusual incidents, and a kind of routine evening that suggested another peaceful day of helping people with research needs. She prepared her workstation with the same methodical precision she brought to all aspects of her carefully constructed existence, reviewed database updates that kept her current with developments in criminal psychology, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of academic assistance that had defined her life for 3 years. The first sign that this Tuesday would be different came at 9:15, when a man in his mid-30s approached her desk with questions about criminal psychology resources that seemed more practical than academic. He was well-dressed, articulate, and presented his research needs with the kind of specific terminology that suggested either professional familiarity with law enforcement or concerning personal interest in criminal methodology. His questions focus on behavioral patterns associated with workplace violence, tactical approaches to controlling multiple individuals simultaneously, and psychological techniques for managing hostage situations. Zara's training kicked in automatically as she assessed the man's demeanor, word choices, and body language for indicators that might suggest his research interests were more than academic. His breathing patterns were slightly elevated. His eye contact was inconsistent with normal anxiety levels, and his questions were framed in ways that suggested practical planning rather than theoretical understanding. These were subtle indicators that most people would miss entirely, but to someone with Zara's background, they represented potential red flags that warranted careful attention. She provided the requested research assistance with professional competence, while mentally cataloging details that might become relevant if her assessment proved accurate. The man's height and build, his clothing choices that suggested preparation for physical activity, the absence of typical academic materials that would normally accompany legitimate research, and most significantly, his interest in information that could be used to plan rather than understand violent scenarios. When the man left the library after 20 minutes of research assistance, Zara made a decision that revealed how thoroughly her federal training had shaped her instincts. She discreetly photographed his identification information from the visitor log, ran his details through databases that were technically outside her current job description, but still accessible through her research credentials, and discovered information that transformed her concern into genuine alarm. The man's background included a recent termination from a technology company located 6 blocks from the library, a history of workplace disputes that had escalated into legal proceedings, and social media activity that suggested increasing anger toward former colleagues and supervisors. More troubling was a pattern of library visits over the past month, all focused on research that could be useful for planning violent confrontations in professional environments. Zara realized she was looking at the preliminary planning stages of what could become a workplace violence incident, possibly involving multiple victims in a location that her current position made her responsible for protecting. The federal agent who still existed inside the research librarian understood that intervention at this stage could prevent a tragedy, but intervention would require revealing expertise that could compromise the anonymity she had spent 3 years constructing. The decision became irrelevant at 11:43, when the same man returned to the library carrying a backpack and moving with a kind of determined purpose that Zara recognized as pre-attack behavior. This time, his demeanor had shifted from research mode to operational mode. His awareness of his surroundings had increased dramatically, and his positioning within the library suggested he was implementing a plan rather than gathering information. Zara activated the library's silent alarm system while maintaining the appearance of normal work activity, sent discreet text messages to security personnel that used coded language to indicate a potential active threat, and began implementing crisis management protocols that she hoped she would never need to use in her civilian identity. But her preparations were interrupted when the man approached her desk directly, his expression and body language indicating that the research phase of his plan was complete and the implementation phase was beginning. "You helped me with research last week," he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that Zara had learned to recognize as immediately preceding violence. Information about controlling multiple people, managing resistance, eliminating witnesses. "I want you to know that you contributed to what's about to happen here." The statement was designed to transfer responsibility and create psychological pressure that would reduce her ability to respond effectively. It was also the kind of manipulation technique that revealed more about his psychological state than he probably intended to share. Zara understood that she was dealing with someone who needed to justify his planned actions by distributing blame to others, which suggested both narcissistic tendencies and underlying uncertainty about his chosen course of action. "Sir," she said calmly, using the tone she had developed for de-escalating situations with disturbed individuals, "I think there might be some confusion about the nature of the research assistance I provided. Perhaps we could discuss your concerns in a more private setting." But the man was beyond de-escalation techniques. He opened his backpack and withdrew what appeared to be a modified pistol, along with materials that suggested he had planned for an extended confrontation rather than a quick resolution. The sight of weapons in the library environment triggered automatic responses that Zara had hoped never to use outside of federal operations, but her civilian identity was about to become irrelevant to survival considerations. "Everyone on the floor," the man announced to the library at large, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from holding weapons in environments where violence is unexpected. "This is about justice, about consequences for people who destroy other people's lives without thinking about the cost." The library's afternoon population included approximately 30 people. College students working on research projects, retired individuals reading newspapers, parents with children attending story time, and several library staff members who had no training for handling armed confrontations. Zara watched as people complied with the gunman's demands, their expressions cycling through confusion, fear, and growing understanding that they were experiencing something far outside their normal reality. The gunman's attention focused on Zara with a kind of personal intensity that suggested his grievances extended beyond general anger into specific blame. "You," he said, pointing the weapon in her direction, "you helped me understand how to do this effectively, how to control multiple people, how to prevent escape, how to make sure nobody interferes until I finish what needs to be finished." Zara realized that her research assistance had been interpreted as collaboration rather than professional service, and that the gunman's psychological profile included the need to involve her directly in whatever violence he planned to commit. This was both dangerous and potentially useful information, because it suggested his primary motivation involved making her witness the consequences of what he perceived as her contribution to his planning process. "Sir," she said, maintaining the calm professional tone while assessing tactical options, "I understand that you're experiencing significant stress related to workplace issues. The research materials you requested are available to anyone, and they're designed to help people understand rather than implement violent solutions to complex problems." Her response was carefully calculated to validate his emotional state without endorsing his planned actions, redirect his attention toward problem-solving rather than violence, and buy time for security responses that she hoped were already in progress. But the psychological profile she was developing suggested someone whose anger had progressed beyond rational intervention and into operational commitment to violence. The gunman's reaction confirmed her assessment. "Don't try to manipulate me," he snapped. "I know what you people do, how you analyze and categorize and reduce people to behavioral patterns that you can control. I research your techniques, and I'm not going to be managed by someone who helped me plan this operation." The statement revealed several important details about his mental state and his level of preparation. He had studied psychological manipulation techniques, which suggested both intelligence and paranoia. He perceived library staff as part of conspiracy rather than neutral service providers, which indicated paranoid ideation that could make him unpredictable. Most significantly, he believed that Zara had deliberately assisted his planning, which meant his anger toward her was personal rather than symbolic. Zara found herself in a position she had hoped never to occupy again, using behavioral analysis skills in a life-or-death situation where wrong assessments could result in civilian casualties. The federal agent who still existed inside the research librarian began implementing crisis management strategies that were far beyond anything taught in library science programs, while simultaneously trying to maintain her civilian identity and protect people who had no idea they were witnessing the reemergence of someone who used to hunt dangerous individuals for a living. "Everyone stay calm," she said to the library patrons, using voice projection techniques that carried authority without seeming aggressive. "Follow instructions, remain seated, and remember that this situation is temporary and manageable." Her words were intended for multiple audiences simultaneously. The civilians needed reassurance and behavioral guidance that would minimize their risk. The gunman needed to hear that she wasn't challenging his control or attempting to organize resistance. Security personnel who might be listening needed to understand that someone inside the building had training for managing crisis situations and could provide tactical intelligence if communication channels could be established. The gunman moved closer to her position, his weapon trained on her the kind of focused attention that suggested she had become central to whatever resolution he had planned for the situation. "You're going to watch," he said. "You're going to see what happens when people get pushed beyond what they can handle, when systems fail people who follow the rules and try to do things the right way." Zara recognized the statement as reflecting a justice-oriented motivation that could be more dangerous than simple anger or revenge. He believed his actions were morally justified, which meant he would be less likely to respond to appeals to conscience or empathy. He also seemed to have planned for her to survive whatever violence he intended to commit, which suggested his primary goal involved making her bear witness, rather than eliminating her directly. "I understand that you've experienced significant injustices," she said, using validation techniques while continuing to assess his psychological state and tactical capabilities. "Workplace termination can be devastating, especially when it feels arbitrary or unfair. But the people in this library aren't responsible for the decisions that affected your employment." Her approach was designed to acknowledge his grievances without endorsing his methods, redirect his anger toward appropriate targets rather than innocent civilians, and establish a rapport that might create opportunities for a peaceful resolution. But she was also preparing for the possibility that de-escalation would fail and that she would need to transition from psychological intervention to physical response. The gunman's answer revealed that his planning had been more extensive than she had initially assessed. The people in this library represent a system that destroys individual lives to protect institutional interests, he said. They participate in research that helps corporations eliminate workers, governments control citizens, and authorities manipulate people who don't understand how these systems operate. The paranoid ideation was more extensive than Zara had initially recognized, which meant rational persuasion would be less effective than she had hoped. He wasn't just angry about personal injustice. He was committed to a conspiracy theory that portrayed library patrons as complicit in systematic oppression. This level of paranoid thinking suggested that violence was more likely to escalate than de-escalate, regardless of her intervention attempts. Zara made the decision that would end her 3 years of anonymity and restart the career she had thought she had left behind. She activated the emergency communication device that she had hoped never to use, a piece of federal equipment that would alert her younger brother Noah to her location and circumstances. Noah Grant worked as a tactical coordinator for the FBI's hostage rescue team, and while their professional relationship had been suspended when she entered protective relocation, family connections existed outside official protocols. The device transmitted her location, a coded assessment of the threat level, and a request for immediate tactical support. More importantly, it identified her by her real credentials rather than her library identity, which meant the response would be coordinated by people who understood her actual capabilities and training level. While waiting for backup that might not arrive in time to prevent civilian casualties, Zara continued implementing crisis management strategies that drew on 6 years of federal experience with violent individuals. She maintained verbal engagement with a gunman to monitor his psychological state, provided discreet guidance to library patrons to minimize their risk exposure, and prepared for possibility that she would need to transition from behavioral intervention to direct action. "Sir," she said, "I can see that you planned the situation carefully and that your grievances are deeply felt. But I think you may have misunderstood the nature of the research assistance I provided. I'm not part of any system designed to harm people. I'm just someone who helps people find information they need for legitimate purposes." The gunman's response revealed that his paranoia extended beyond workplace issues into broader conspiracy theories about information control and social manipulation. "Everyone claims they're just doing their job," he said. "Just following procedures, just providing services, just helping people find what they need. But the system depends on people like you who make it easier for authorities to understand and control individual behavior." Zara realized she was dealing with someone whose anger had evolved into systematic paranoia that made rational intervention unlikely to succeed. The psychological profile she was developing suggested someone who would escalate rather than de-escalate, regardless of her attempts to establish rapport or redirect his anger toward appropriate channels. 22 minutes after the situation began, tactical personnel began arriving at the library's perimeter. Zara could see movement through the building's windows that indicated professional coordination rather than standard law enforcement response. The presence of federal tactical units meant that her emergency signal had been received and that Noah had convinced his supervisors to treat this as a potential terrorism incident rather than standard workplace violence. The gunman noticed the external activity and reacted with a kind of increased agitation that Zara had expected based on his psychological profile. "You called them," he said, his weapon now pointed directly at her head. "You're part of the system, just like I thought. This whole conversation has been manipulation designed to keep me talking while they organize a response." Zara understood that the situation had reached a point where verbal de-escalation was no longer viable and where physical intervention might be necessary to prevent civilian casualties. The federal agent who had spent 6 years hunting dangerous individuals prepared to emerge from behind the research librarian, who had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that hadn't been present in any of her previous statements, "I need you to understand that you're surrounded by tactical personnel who are trained to resolve these situations with minimal civilian casualties. The best outcome for everyone involves putting down your weapon and allowing trained negotiators to address your legitimate grievances through appropriate channels." The change in her demeanor was subtle but significant. The nervous librarian was gone, replaced by someone who spoke with the confidence of experience in crisis situations. The gunman noticed a difference and reacted with suspicion that confirmed his paranoid ideation. "Who are you really?" he demanded. "Nobody talks like that unless they've been trained for these situations. You're not just a librarian. You're part of their system." Zara realized that maintaining her civilian identity was no longer possible or tactically advisable. The situation had progressed beyond the point where her cover story would be useful, and her actual training was now necessary for protecting civilian lives. "You're correct," she said calmly. "I'm not just a librarian. I'm someone who used to hunt people like you for a living, and I'm very good at understanding how situations like this typically end." The revelation changed the dynamic completely. The gunman understood that he was no longer dealing with a civilian victim, but with someone whose training might exceed his own preparation. The library patrons realized they were witnessing something far outside their understanding of normal reality. And somewhere outside the building, Noah Grant was coordinating a tactical response to save his sister, who was supposed to be safely anonymous in her civilian identity. The confrontation that followed would determine whether Zara's 3 years of hiding had been worth the cost of her federal career, whether her skills were still adequate for protecting innocent people, and whether the identity she had built as a research librarian could survive the revelation of who she used to be. The gunman's final decision, when it came, revealed both the effectiveness of her behavioral assessment and the limitations of psychological intervention when dealing with individuals who had progressed beyond rational thinking into operational commitment to violence. The tactical response that followed demonstrated why some people are never really retired from dangerous work, why certain skills remain relevant regardless of official employment status, and why heroes sometimes emerge from the most unlikely civilian identities. When the situation was finally resolved, Noah Grant found his sister sitting calmly at her library desk, surrounded by grateful civilians and impressed tactical personnel, filing an incident report with the same methodical precision she brought to research assistants. The quiet librarian who had spent 3 years helping people find information had just demonstrated that sometimes the most important research involves reading people rather than books, and that the most valuable databases contain information about human behavior rather than academic sources. Zara Mitchell would return to her position at the Chicago Central Library, but her anonymity would never be quite the same. Too many people had witnessed a moment when a research librarian became a federal agent, when civilian skills proved inadequate for protecting innocent lives, and when someone who was supposed to be safely hidden revealed capabilities that belonged to a different kind of professional entirely. The gunman survived his encounter with someone who understood criminal psychology better than he understood his own motivations. The library patrons gained a new appreciation for the people who maintain quiet, safe spaces in an unpredictable world. And Noah Grant learned that family connections sometimes transcend official protocols, especially when the people you love turn out to be exactly who you always suspected they were beneath their carefully constructed civilian identities.